Hello everyone, my name is Ben Eady and I'm the Online Media Manager of ModernAnalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's event titled Being Rational in an Accelerated World. Today's featured speaker is Keith Ellis, VP of Marketing and Strategic Alliances at IAG Consulting. The webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including the Q&A session. So make sure to submit your questions in advance using the question feature on the webinar software. I'd also like to say thank you to IAG for sponsoring this event, and at this time, I'll turn it over to Keith to get us started.
Good afternoon, and welcome to Being Rational in an Accelerated World. My name is Keith Ellis, and I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Strategic Alliances here at IAG Consulting. You know, we've been asked a number of times, and almost repeatedly over the last bunch of months, about analyst tools and the kinds of tools that are available to people, how they can be used, how they can be deployed. Hey, give us more specific examples. And so we decided, let's start looking at these in a little bit more systematic way for people, and let's start talking to people about what different analyst technologies are out there and available. And certainly when we start talking about rational tool sets, we start talking about other kinds of tool sets, one of the things that keeps coming back is, how is this impacting the speed of our organization? Can I have speed and modeling? Can I make these things synergistic? Because there's this perception that when I add in a tool set, I'm slowing down my overall analytics, I'm creating problems for myself in different areas, and these are just not true. You really can make speed and modeling very synergistic out there, and I want to show you how you can do that specifically within the rational tool set. So what we're talking about here is trying to create synergy. We're trying to focus in on how do you use these tools much earlier in the elicitation process than you might normally be looking at. And that way you get better downstream use of the tool. And then we want to make sure that, and everybody knows, this is going to be a deep dive into the rational tool set, how it's used, how you configure it, and then they've got the new Rational Composer out there. You know, how does that get worked into your overall requirements discovery management strategy as a whole? So with that, let me give you a couple of just pieces on the way through. Because we've only got about 250 people participating in this session today, I can make this fairly interactive, keeping an eye out for questions and things like that. And I'll probably get a chance to answer many of those, you know, either during the session or just after the session, etc. Some of your more technical ones, what I may do is defer those to one of our local people who's an expert in the rational tool set, Enrique Pelicios. And Enrique then can get back to you with your answers. But certainly somebody will get back to you with an answer to your question in the very near future. We'll be able to help you with that, okay? So if you do have questions, just pop them into the Q&A space. As most people who have participated in these sessions before know, you can just pop them into the Q&A space, and then I will get back to them over the course of the thing. Okay, so let's continue and let's talk about what we're going to get into today. Today we're going to talk about rapid elicitation, and that is a very specific concept where you're trying to take, and what you're trying to do is radically compress the overall cycle of discovering requirements. You're radically compressing it. So rather than taking 2 or 3 months to go and get requirements on a project, you're going to take, you know, a 5-day cycle to go and get requirements on a project. So the idea is because you're trying to push these tools, you're trying to see if you can take these tools and run them in a highly accelerated environment. So let's show how this particular tool set, the rational products, can be done in that particular way. So yes, I'm going to talk about IBM Rational. I put the little registered trademark thing on the Rational here. Just look, it is a registered trademark. It's not consistent all the way through my presentation that I've got the IBM product that's properly denoted. So, you know, mea culpa on that particular one. But, you know, we are going to drill down on the IBM Rational product sets, and specifically we're going to talk about Composer, we're going to talk about Requisite Pro, we're going to talk about a couple of other pieces along the way that you're really going to use for the discovery and management cycle. Okay, you don't need all 70-odd products that are in here. What you need are 3 or 4 that might tie together in a specific way. In fact, I'm going to recommend that you tie them together in a very specific way with very specific artifacts hanging into very specific products along the way, because you can't get duplication. As soon as you get duplication, you're going to have all kinds of problems. Now, we're also going to talk about enabling a process, because at the end of the day, great requirements are not a document. Great requirements come from a process. It's the process that you need to concentrate on more than anything else. And so we're going to talk a little bit about rapid elicitation as a process and what those pieces are in there. And I'm going to talk about the different product sets as you go through different stages in the process. Because you can't just bring in a tool and expect all of a sudden that your processes are going to be fixed. What you can do is bring in tools to automate certain elements of your process and bring discipline to certain elements of your process that are going to augment how that process operates. But fundamentally, great requirements come first and foremost from having a great requirements discovery process. And so I'm going to make sure that we're talking about that as we go through the discussion today. Now, one slide on IAG and where we're coming from, because I think it's important that people understand where we're coming from as an organization. We've been at this for a long time. The requirements discovery management space is all we do in life. We've done something like 1,200 engagements in that space and worked with something like 300 of the Fortune 500 companies. And, you know, from a context perspective, most of the time, people don't phone me up and say, hey, Keith, I got an easy one for you today. What they'll do is they'll call me up and say, hey, Keith, I've got something that, gosh, I've got, you know, difficulties with my analyst teams, or I've got new analysts, or I've got, you know, maybe unionized stakeholders, or I've got 300 stakeholders that need to be involved in this thing, and I need those guys organized. You know, there's something about it. So it's a much bigger project than what they're usually doing. These kinds of things are why people give us a call, and typically they're calling us for larger scale engagements. So that's a bit of a bias of our organization, is how do you make tool sets like this work when you're dealing with something that's maybe in excess of $250,000 in development, or maybe it's $300 million in development, but you know, you're going to run the same kinds of things. We've spent a lot of time training and developing organizations, so that means that, you know, I will tend to simplify things a little bit more, just so we can help people really identify and understand, you know, what it is that we're trying to accomplish. Let's bring it back to business principles and basics first and foremost, because the rest of it will start to flow beyond that. And we have a lot of partners. Today, I'm really going to focus in on the Rational tool set rather than other tools that are out there that we work with. Okay, the learning objectives, and this is what I committed to doing. So if I hit these learning objectives, absolutely, you know, send me an email, say, hey, Keith, I think you got it today. If I don't hit them, send me that email that says, hey, Keith, you really missed it on this particular point. And that way, when we run this particular session again, we will adjust what we're doing. I want to make sure that we're really focusing in on the things that are adding value to people and then eliminating stuff that's just not as useful for people. But today, we're going to identify what the benefits are of using a rapid requirements elicitation approach. I think it's important for people to understand the differences between this kind of thing and the demands of rapid requirement elicitation and what that places on the software environment. It's a unique thing. You're talking about really accelerating requirements discovery. As a result, many tools just can't do this kind of thing. They can't keep pace with the facilitator or the facilitation team. It's just not possible. So that's why I pulled this particular one out to say, okay, well, let's show you an environment where you're really pushing the tool set to the max. Can the IBM tool set stand up? And let's show you how you can use it to accommodate it to this very, very difficult environment. Now, let's talk about the ways in which the products get used during the elicitation process. And I underscore that word process. Okay, underscore that word, because again, great requirements comes from fantastic. Great requirements comes from fantastic process. It's not really a deliverable. You know, you have to have good deliverables that are coming out, but unless you've got great process in place, you're really not going to have great deliverables. So let's understand how the product's going to be used to support it, and then what the artifacts are that are going to be produced and where those artifacts are coming from. Because it is a complex tool set environment. You're talking about integrating multiple tools. Not every tool is housing every single artifact out there. You have to know where you're housing certain things. You're going to get duplication. And as soon as you start getting duplication, all of a sudden you're trying to manage multiple repositories with similar sets of information, and it just comes apart. It's just not a good way to go. So what we're going to do is identify where you're housing certain artifacts and deliverables to reduce the overall amount of redundancy and reduce any possibility that you're modeling the same information in two different ways. So let's talk about what requirements, rapid requirements elicitation is. Gosh, don't try to say that too early in the morning. What is rapid requirements elicitation? It is The idea is that you're producing clear, accurate, and complete requirements in a very, very short time block. So think about taking a $1 million project, client-side spend, and compressing the requirements discovery down into a 1 week, meaning 5-day cycle. A $250,000 project, you're doing the same thing. A $500,000, you're doing the same thing. For very large-scale projects, you're getting equivalent compression. So the idea is very, very short time periods from basically standing start, the company knows very little even about the scope of this thing, to having a rich understanding of the business requirements associated with it. And it's going to be characterized by certain kinds of changes to the way you do the requirements. So first and foremost, you're talking about bringing the right stakeholders to the table. So you're running group-facilitated meetings. You're going to have cross-functional discussions, potentially with executives or managers, but certainly the business stakeholders. They all have to be at the table. Why? Because you're trying to describe, first and foremost, what the business wants to accomplish, not how it's going to do it. You're not doing design sessions here. You're trying to help people discover and describe their business processes and how those business processes are going to run. So in order to do that, there's some decisions that need to be made. You've got to bring that executive team to the table. You've got to have effective scoping, which means right up front, being able to break down very complex projects very quickly into their component parts and then being able to elaborate those component parts. That is something that you really need the tool to be able to help you to do. And because if you don't do it in a very systematic way, you're going to have meetings that are going to run off, hither and yon into different directions. All of a sudden become very unproductive for certain people, and then they start not wanting to participate. The idea of effective scoping is when you break down your high-level, your overall project into a series of high-level scenarios, or a high-level scenario, each scenario element or use case piece that you're going to look at has certain stakeholders attached to it. Now all of a sudden, those stakeholders that are attached to it, those guys are included in the meetings at that point in time. Now all of a sudden, they're always discussing something that is important and it's relevant to them. So that's going to be important to them. Facilitated process walkthroughs. And what I mean by that is you have somebody who is charged with making these discussions as efficient and effective as possible. So somebody is up at the front of the room driving the process. Just like I say, a team of 2 analysts at the bottom here, you've got somebody in the back of the room who is the requirements architect, and they are capturing the information as it comes out of the room. So think about just how fast you can go. You've got all the right people at the table. You've got somebody at the front of the room who is facilitating that team, driving them through, making decisions, and helping them, and by asking the right questions at the right time, helping them to drive through to consensus quickly and efficiently, pulling out their complete process and information model associated with a particular area that they want to automate, somebody in the back of the room capturing. Imagine how fast that is going to go. You really are compressing, and you're basically modeling just as, imagine you're modeling almost as fast as a person can type, okay? It's that kind of pace. So what you're going to do as a result of that is you need to have live documentation. You need to be able to capture the results of what's going on in the room in real time, and you're going to be capturing that just about as fast as you could possibly type. Then you have to do what we'll call offline modeling, because whatever technologies you're using, it's very difficult for a person to model as fast as you can physically just describe a business process. And because you want it to be effective or efficient for the group, because the stakeholder experience is the most important thing out there, you don't want to slow the sessions by forcing yourself into modeling first and foremost, meaning drawing pictures of the process. Drawing the pictures of the process is secondary. Getting the process understood and captured and down on a sheet of paper or captured into the interface is primary. Pulling it out into the sequence diagrams or activity flow diagrams is secondary. You're going to do that offline. Then you're going to make sure you're using industry best practices and techniques. So I'm going to talk about some of those standard techniques that we use at different points in time. But fundamentally, you need to use a team of 2 analysts. If you try to do modeling at the same time as you're doing information capture and you're trying to accelerate the whole thing, you're kind of
you're going to be able to do any two of those, but you're not going to be able to do all three of those effectively. So that's why I wanted to give you guys a picture of rapid requirements elicitation, because the concept is very, very fast, efficient use of the stakeholders' time. And today, and especially in today's environment, one of the big rate-determining steps, is the availability of stakeholders out there to participate in sessions. And so if you make it more difficult for them to participate, gosh, you know what's going to happen? They're going to be less likely to want to participate. But you don't have to be in a situation where your tool environment is forcing a certain kind of interaction. And that's what I want to show you today, is that your tool environment really can be very, very transparent to the stakeholders. It's augmenting to the stakeholders rather than limiting to the stakeholders if you do it in a certain way. And it's not adding a tremendous amount in terms of overhead on the overall analyst team. That's what we're trying to accomplish when we're talking about rapid requirements elicitation and this specific tool environment in IBM Requisite. So let's kind of give you an example of what I mean by requirements in a week. So requirements in a week, this is something that IAG does. It's just a standard thing. It's you're dealing with a project that's $250,000 client-side spend or $1 million client-side spend, these kinds of things. What you're going to do is you're going to basically take 5 business days to scope the project, facilitate and discover the requirements, and produce all of those deliverables that are to the right. Now, every one of those, except for maybe the CRUD matrix, you can do within the IBM Rational toolset. So you can, in fact, pull out and produce a requirements management plan. We can create the templates, and we can push those into Requisite Pro, and we can manage it inside. So absolutely, you can do that kind of thing. The requirements, the SMART list of objectives, these kinds of things. What I mean by SMART is specific, measurable, actionable, results-oriented, and time-bounded. These are more objectives-oriented statements. You absolutely can do that kind of activity in a very short. You can get that within the Requisite Pro tool set. The scope definition pieces, the UML activity diagrams are going to be pieces that you do in certain parts of the tool set. So all of these deliverables that we're producing, depends on the different environments that somebody's working with. If they're not a UML shop, then we're not producing certain kinds of things. But that's your list of deliverables, and you're taking it down to what I'll call a mid-level detail use case. It's business requirements, not a full software spec. It's business requirements, but you've got a very detailed level in terms of a mid-level detail on what you're producing. And the benefits of doing this are fairly clear. At least they're fairly straightforward. The idea is that you want to dramatically reduce the amount of change to requirements long-term. You want a better view on the requirements. And RDP is the requirements discovery process. That's IAG's methodology that we're talking about here. And what we found is that by doing this much more compressed approach, you're reducing the amount of change on requirements over the life cycle of the project by about 75%. So the idea here is that you get a better capturing, much faster but better capturing, and greater level of consensus on requirements up front. By reducing the ambiguity on it, you are also reducing the amount of changes you're going to see over time. As a result of that, or one of the big issues in here is by using much more compressed cycles to get it, you're going to reduce the amount of time needed to get the requirements by about 58%. So the idea here, when you're using a tool set, any tool set, it's to minimize the disruption to the stakeholder experience. And in this particular case here, when we're talking about the IBM Rational tool set, we really feel that you can get far more compression with the stakeholders because you can do a lot of the modeling offline, you can do a lot of the actual capture within the rooms, and you can produce a much more robust document and then do the sharing of that amongst the different members of the team that have to sign off on it. And as a result of having far fewer changes to your requirements and doing it in a much shorter period of time, you end up getting a significant reduction in the total cost of doing the deliverables. Now this is from 36 projects that we measured across 6 different client organizations where we're pairing our methodology against we're pairing projects of similar size and scope and functionality where we're using our methodology versus whatever they happen to be using internally. So you can see the benefits of trying to do rapid requirements elicitation, and I encourage anybody who's trying to make transformational change to their IT organization to consider this kind of approach. And again, the reason why I'm emphasizing rapid requirement solicitations is because when you're doing that kind of environment, you really are pushing the analyst technology to the max, because you're creating very specific kinds of issues, very specific kinds of issues that many different kinds of technologies are just completely unable to address. And the speed of the interface and these other kinds of things become very, very difficult to deal with when you're dealing with this kind of accelerated environment. So let's talk about the IBM products that we're looking at using, or we use when we do this kind of thing. And they're all the Rational Toolset products that we use. And let's talk about, first and foremost, just setting the stage for this. What are the issues? What are the requirements of the technology? What's different here when we're doing rapid requirement solicitation? Now, let me create a picture for you. Again, let me reinforce it. If you look at the picture on the right, that's really showing what we're doing. We're almost papering the room with what we call static sheets. And these static sheets are just, they're like lightweight, almost the Glad kitchen catcher, you know what I mean, that kind of weight of plastic. And they stick up on the walls all by themselves. And you've got our facilitator at the front of the room. They are driving people through to consensus. They're taking that management team, and you see the lady sitting in the front of the room. That person is capturing the results of the session as they're going, and they're doing that in real time. So you can, again, envision just how fast you're doing this. So what you need to have is a lightning-fast interface. You need to have a very, very fast ability to capture the discussion as it's going on in the room. Now, the IBM product sets, you know, they're okay. You know, if you're trying to model, like physically model within the room, you're going to get into trouble. But what we did is we actually have an IAG plugin that we put into the Requisite Pro product, and that allows us to capture into a particular template that is actually extremely fast. You need to be able to model once and use many times. So what I mean by that is you cannot have the same kind of information broken up into many different places or trying to model it in many different places, because you will get into all kinds of problems. You'll get redundancy, and as soon as you get redundancy, then one set of information within the repository gets out of date to another set of information in a repository. So either you're going to get bidirectional interface or bidirectional integration, you know, a tool set that does that, or you have to get a tool set that's going to pull and assemble information from all of these different repositories where you're housing the models, pull that into a centralized and produce a centralized document which is representing the current information from all these flows. And that's the way we're going to do it here with the IBM toolset. We're going to keep the models in the tool sets that are best for housing those models, and we're going to pull that information through Requisite Pro to produce a BRD, a business requirements document that best represents the current state of the information. You do need to produce an integrated business requirements document, and this is huge, huge, huge problems for some of the different tool sets that are out there. Think about it. Tools invariably parse information into component pieces, and they house that information sometimes in very complex, cumbersome ways. So some tools, it's very, very difficult to produce a single integrated business requirements document that you can turn around and then hand to users and actually represent the information to users in a format which is familiar to them. Like, you know, if you are forcing users to take on, you know, certain kinds of techniques, like let's go into the UML, and you've got, you know, state change diagrams. I mean, it's very difficult for a stakeholder to look at that information and understand what you're talking about. So if you've got that mixed in with other basic business process information, it becomes very cumbersome. So you want to strip all that other stuff away and get down into something that's much easier for them to understand and much more familiar in familiar format. So that's one of the key issues that we get into, is that when you're evaluating different technology stacks or different technologies from different vendors, is how close are you to being able to produce an integrated business requirements document that has only the information that you need, so none of the information that you don't need and all of the information that you do need, And how easy is it to produce something that's fairly customized that matches your existing SDLC? That's a difficult thing. We also need to be able to capture multiple domains of information. So what I mean by a domain of information is process information is a domain of information. Data information is a domain of information. Project information is a domain of information. Requirements information is a domain of information. These are all very different. And some tools specialize in, say, process modeling, or some tools specialize in visualization. Some tools specialize in data modeling, or they're only UML tools, or whatever it is. And so they all have these weaknesses out there. What you want to do is you want to look at a tool set that has all domains, or the appropriate domains of information being captured. And we're also using this in a multi-user kind of way, because we've got multiple analysts that are working sometimes across geographically spread teams, all working back to sometimes a centralized information repository on a single project. So that's very common for our customers, and it's very common for our kind of environment that we're working in. So those are some base requirements, kind of at a business level, for the technology, and not many technologies can do this kind of thing. So let's talk a little bit about the IBM technologies that we would be integrating together. So first and foremost, you've got to have the collaborative, and unfortunately I can't break this diagram apart to bring it up to pieces, or I would, but upper left, what we want to do is make sure you've got the authoring for the analysts. And we're going to do that with IBM, the Requirements Composer, okay? So the upper left stuff we're going to do with Composer, the business processes, getting the documents together, the use cases, the storyboard, all those kinds of things are going to be Composer. And then the ability to share that out and do the web reviewing with the stakeholders, again, Composer. We're going to use Requisite Pro in here and Software Architect. And Software Architect is particularly when you need to start going down into the UML modeling, or you're going to consider doing code generation. But the Requisite Pro is kind of that glue in the middle as well, because what we're going to do is we're going to be able to pull from all of these other components into Requisite Pro to be able to produce your single integrated requirements document, okay? So you do need all of these different component pieces, and I'll talk about next where you can kind of pull away and say, oh my gosh, look at all these pieces we need. But it's not that complicated. You see, one of the issues you're going to get into is what detail level do you need to produce? So if you're dealing with only a business requirements document, you can get by with the Requirements Composer and Requisite Pro, because many of the detail level elements are part of Rational Software Architect. The detail elements are there. So it's only really when you're dealing with system requirements that you need to put in Rational Software Architect, or if your company is a UML shop. So if you're emphasizing UML, then you go and put in Rational Software Architect. Or if your business analysts also produce not only business requirements but system requirements, or they're pulling down to full requirement specification, then you start putting in this. And the reason being is because you need the more detailed activity diagram capability, the stereotyping capability, class diagramming capability, data modeling capability that you'd normally associate with Rational Software Architect. That's all stuff that's in there. It's not easily housed in the other two product sets, okay? So again, you're dealing with a fairly limited set of the total IBM products, the 70-odd products out there, right? So you're dealing with a fairly limited number of them to be able to do rapid requirements elicitation on the way through here. Now, your artifact strategy, this is, again, speaking at a high level. Before we start getting into the details of this thing, before we start really digging down into what we're trying to do here, the artifact strategy then becomes very important. What we try to do always is to mirror the existing in-house documentation structure strategy. The reason why is because it minimizes the amount of change that you have to deal with when you're implementing a particular tool set. So whether it's our analysts, and we're training or cross-training those analysts to use the Requisite Pro or the IBM Rational tool set on a product on an engagement, or we are implementing a center of excellence for a client, And that center of excellence, what we realize is that the client really has very poor technology infrastructure, and they're getting problems downstream, let's say with testing, or problems downstream with coding, or problems downstream with all kinds of downstream problems. And they need to better improve, they need to improve the technology set that they have upstream to make sure they alleviate these downstream problems. Then you might implement the IBM Rational tool sets to be able to dramatically improve. But you want to mirror, in all circumstances, you want to mirror what is really working well today within the organization, or else you create all kinds of your own unique problems trying to implement this. The second thing is you've got to get consistency through your setup framework. And what I mean by that is two analysts running a similar product or project should end up with similar documentation and similar structures of information. The challenge with any tool set that's got more robust flexibility is that you can create a situation where two analysts running similar projects end up with vastly different documentation and documentation quality on those projects, even though they're using the same tool set. And the way you fix that is through the framework. I'm going to talk about all of these in a lot more detail as I go through this. But the strategy itself is critical. So that's what we focus on. We focus on, hey, we want to minimize change. We want to make sure we've got a really robust structured documentation, first and foremost, that our stakeholders understand clearly, accurately, and completely, because that's critical. The second thing that's critical is that we get consistency in our execution through this thing. And the third thing is you've got to think of this like a process. If you don't think of it like a process, then you start doing things that are a little wonky and putting overhead into that process that doesn't need to be there. So when we say think of it as like a process, one of the more important elements to consider is how efficient this is for your business stakeholder. Because it's very easy to adopt a technology and make the experience of doing requirements very cumbersome for your stakeholders. So what we want to do is when we're working with a tool set like Rational or any of the other tool sets that we work with, we want to make sure that it's not interrupting that client experience, it's not interrupting that stakeholder experience, because that has to be efficient. So I'm going to talk about these three in a little bit more detail because I think that they're absolutely essential and critical to the process. So when we do it, a business requirements document, we want that document to look identical to what our existing standard is, because we know our existing standard works for 99% of our clients, well, 95% of our clients. So what we're going to do is we're going to produce that document out of Requisite Pro. What we're going to do, though, is we're going to pull the pieces that are needed for that, like the process activity diagrams. We're going to pull those from another IBM product set. We're going to pull the context diagrams from a different one. We're going to pull the use case diagrams from a different one. Okay, so the idea is that the Requisite Pro tool set is going to be able to pull from, say, Software Architect or Composer or some other thing. We're going to pull those elements into one common document. That way, you're only modeling once, but you're pulling into a common document all of the content that's necessary and that you would normally see in a business requirements document. Now, the technique that you're using to render the information may be slightly different, but it's still providing you with something that is very familiar to the stakeholders. You've got a business requirements document. It's in a printed way. It's familiar. It's not parsing the information out into a million different little pieces and forcing somebody to go through all these little piece parts and mentally assemble it into the whole. You've got it into a very logical and organized, systematic business process, business requirements document that you're using. The next thing is getting the consistency, and this one's a little harder for people who haven't used tool sets before, but again, the challenge is that any tool set is going to parse information into buckets, okay? And those buckets, or packages, as you'd call it in a tool set world, may or may not be consistent from analyst to analyst to analyst. So when you're working with a tool set like this, and in Requisite Pro specifically, what you want to do is preload the deck so that you've got certain packages that are set up in advance, so that every time an analyst does a project, they're loading the same set of packages so that you can link to certain kinds of information. Now, there are obvious ones and then there's not obvious ones. The obvious ones are going to be things like, hey, I need my context model, I need my requirements model, I need my functional and non-functional, blah, blah, blah. Okay? But there are other ones that you need to start thinking about or considering that are not as obvious and you might miss. So for example, tools sometimes don't have the concept of project. And what I mean by that is you've got functional requirements, non-functional information requirements, things like that. They all get reused across many different projects. And so you want to harvest those into one particular kind of object because you're going to basically be able to reuse and share that set of information. But project-level information, like the motivation, the business objectives, the business casing, these other kinds of things, you need to capture because you're picking that information up and you want to produce it back into a business requirements document. But you don't necessarily treat it the same way. You're not going to harvest it, manage it the same way. It's not going to carry on downstream in the same way. So you've got less obvious elements in here that you need to deal with. You also have to set up certain techniques or preload certain techniques for things like your context models, for things like how you're going to do other elements in here. If you don't do that, then you get inconsistency in the way the analysts are capturing the information. So you get all kinds of problems. If you do create the standards like this, and the standard set up in something like a Rec Pro, then you'll get far more consistency on the way through. Now, I've got a question from Jim. Yes, you can get my slides. All you need to do is send me an email to kls@iag.biz, and I will turn around and send you the slides. Now, that email address will be on the last slide in the presentation as well, so you can absolutely get that, okay? Now, again, you're trying to get the reuse higher, right, downstream. So you need to make sure that as analysts are working with this, they're getting consistent about how they're recording and capturing information. And you can use the frameworks to do that. You kind of preload the deck in your favor. So the stakeholder experience, let's talk about this. The stakeholder is going to go through basically, 3 phases of this whole of requirements, 3 different areas. And their needs will change depending on what they're doing, whether they're discovering requirements, review and validating the requirements, or they're managing the requirements downstream. Their issues are going to change. But it's critical that the stakeholder experience be efficient. So let's talk about the elements in here, what I mean by this. So when you're doing requirements discovery, the requirements discovery sessions themselves have to be fast. You cannot slow it behind the technology. You can't pretend that you can do real-time modeling or complex kinds of modeling unless you're hyper-efficient with the tool. It's very difficult to do that kind of thing. People get, and you don't want to suck people into saying, oh my God, it's the technology guys doing techno-whiz things. You don't want to scare them off. Don't slow it either by that. The next thing is you're doing review and validation. So review and validation, the experience is going to be how efficient you are at collecting or collaborating on the comments. So here is the initial requirements document. We need your comments. And can you maintain this? Can you get version controlling going on? Can you share it out to your stakeholders and be efficient at sharing it out to the stakeholders and sharing those comments amongst the rest of the group? And in this particular case, IBM toolset's pretty good at this. Requirements review is making sure that you're getting a single document that's very familiar. That's the most critical element in requirements review, and it has to be familiar to the stakeholders, And then visualization is another thing that people like to do when you're doing the validation review. You created the initial business requirements document. You go from there to a visualization of what this might look like in a mock-up, and again, some of the IBM toolsets are extremely good at that. And then managing the requirements is getting into the requirements change. And the big question there is being able to assess impact when you're dealing with a complex system. So if I eliminate certain requirements in here or I change certain processes, what is that affecting downstream? And that's going to be the big question that the stakeholders are going to have. So the more efficient you are in answering that question, the better off your strategy is going to be. So here's some lessons learned. Just, let's be practical about this. No tool set is perfect, but you must know that your process is going to be efficient using a particular tool. So we've set out some criteria for this tool set that raises the bar pretty high because we're talking about very rapid elicitation. So we know that the tool set can be efficiently used. And it ain't going to be perfect. There's going to be some changes to your process that you have to deal with. There's going to be some accommodations that you're going to have to deal with. But the reason why you want to use the tool is because you've got these downstream activities that are extremely important for you. downstream activities like the integration to your development function, downstream activities like how you're running your testing activities associated with this, downstream activities associated with requirements management that are critically important. You say, wow, if I get those, then it's worth the upfront challenges that I get into. And know you have to be careful about how much change you're introducing to the organization when you're adopting a tool. So you're not going to adopt a tool simply to automate kind of word Visio, or what you would kind of accomplish with word Visio. You have to have very strong reasons that are bringing downstream benefit or upstream benefit or some other broader and very significant benefit to the organization. You have to focus on that. And that other benefit that you're trying to attack is going to bring some degree of change to the organization, whether you're educating stakeholders, your analyst team, your developers, the whole gamut of these people. There's some degree of change. The more you can minimize that and make things more familiar, the more successful your overall strategy is going to be. And then the tool will bring discipline to your practices. So that's a good thing about the tool, is that whatever tool you're implementing, you focus the tool on the areas where you want to add discipline. So if it's really more consistency-oriented that you want to, bring to your organization, then you have to focus more on the frameworks to drive that consistency. If it's more, because that'll create discipline on that, right? If it's more the modeling, or if it's more the downstream, or some of the testing activities associated with being able to integrate these, then you focus your discipline in that area to optimize what you're trying to do. Let's talk about the artifacts and deliverables required here. And I'm going to get into, unfortunately, it's a very complex chart, and it's going to take a little while to go through it. I couldn't break it into pieces to show you. So I'm going to apologize for how difficult this chart is to work with. But stick with me, and I'll try to kind of walk through it in a little bit of detail. See, because down the left-hand side, I'm showing you the different stages that people are involved in. And across the top, I'm showing the tasks, the tool pieces that you're using, and the results. So what are the artifacts that you're producing or using within the overall piece? And the reason why you need this is because the artifact or the elements change as you go through this. And it's going to be a little tougher for me to do, but I'm going to try to see if I can use the highlighter here. And unfortunately, you can see that I've got a lousy highlighter. But anyway, so we're going to talk about this initiation and preliminary analysis first and foremost, this element right up in here, okay? So when we're talking about that, the first thing we're doing is you're preparing for the session. So you've got your analysts preloading templates that will allow them first and foremost to capture the requirements quickly, and you're going to do that in Requisite Pro, and you're going to set up the packages, so the object types, the documentation that you're going to work with. And there's obvious ones and not obvious ones. The obvious ones, things like functional requirements, non-functional, the information requirements, etc. Non-obvious elements are going to be motivations, so mission, vision, value, goals, objectives, these kinds of things, or different model types like the context diagrams and the data models. The reason being is all of these object types are linkable. So what it allows you to do is it allows you to set it up in a way that's consistent, but more importantly, set it up in a way that you can begin linking downstream elements to it. So now next what I'm going to talk about is this requirements planning thing in here. And requirements planning is where you're doing your initial scoping, estimation, discussion with the team, and you're really trying to model the in-scope elements. So that you might call it a level 0 diagram if you're familiar with enterprise architecture terminology, but it's probably easier for people to understand it as you're trying to set up the context diagram, and you're trying to set up the main scenario, the cross and the end-to-end scenario for a particular system that you're looking at. So the end-to-end scenario is kind of the internal view of scope, and the context diagram is the external view of scope. So context diagram being, here's your system in the middle, and all of the entities that you're interacting with through that system are kind of on the outside, and the lines between them is the information that you're sharing. That's a context diagram. And you're going to do that using Rational Requirements Composer, preferably. Or if you're a UML shop, then you've got to switch over, and you're probably best doing it in a Rational Software Architect, okay, if you're a UML shop. Again, if you're a UML shop, there's certain things that you're doing because you're using UML standards, and the best way to do that is Software Architect versus trying to do it in Requirements Composer. The Requirements Composer is a perfectly acceptable tool, and it's fantastic for this kind of thing. Okay, so The next element here is going to do the requirements elicitation. And this, the most important element, is the live capture of information. You cannot slow down the process. So what we're going to say is use the IAG templates. And so we've got a plugin for this. And basically it allows you to capture in a Word-like, in a Word document with Visio plugins within it, all within the requisite pro. And the reason you're doing that is because you want one dashboard. You want one interface, one place that analysts are going to create their initial documentation. And you're going to create from that your use case text and your card. What I mean by card specification is all the constraints, the assumptions, the risks, the dependencies, all those kinds of things that are necessary on the way through. Now, the next element in here is the review, validation, and analysis piece, this part down here. And that's where you get into the modeling. And you're going to do that very iteratively. You're going to basically be iterative against your requirements elicitation elements. So every evening, so let's say you're doing elicitation from 9:30 in the morning till 3:30 in the afternoon. Right after that, at 3:30, you start doing your modeling. You start pulling apart the use case text, start creating the process models associated with that, creating the business activity models associated with that, creating the business information models associated with that. And most of the time, you're going to use Requirements Composer to do that kind of thing, unless, again, you're a UML shop, you want to use the software architect pieces of this. Well, what that does is it gives you your level 1 process diagrams, use case diagrams, all the other UML diagrams, if you're, again, UML shop, etc., all the way down through. So those elements are critical. And then finally, that review, validation, acceptance phase, you're going to use Requisite Pro, and you're going to use, again, Requirements Composer to do that. So those are the tasks and the stages and the elements that you're going to use to produce. And the reason why you want to do this is because you've got a key concept here that you have to follow with, and that's model only once. And because if you're modeling the same information in multiple places, then you're going to get into all kinds of problems. And I'm going to show you where you're modeling the certain information along the way. And that way, and I've got a question in from Brian. Brian, yes, you can get the templates. Just send me an email, and I can, or go on to www.iag.biz. Just register there, and you can grab the IAG templates from there. That will plug into Requisite Pro. So you want to model only once. You can't be modeling a bunch of times because you'll get redundancy. So let me show you how you're using it. So the Rational Requirements Composer, what you're going to model there and house in that tool set are the process diagrams, the use case diagrams, use case descriptions, and the requirements list. That's the set of information that you really want within Requirements Composer. It's fantastic for that kind of thing. You want to use the tool that's best designed for that particular activity, because you can use Requisite Pro to harvest from all these other tools and pull to the central point a common requirements document. So you're going to use Requisite Pro. So you don't care if you've got this the process diagram sitting out in Requirements Composer, because you can pull it from there into Requisite Pro. Okay. The next thing is you can use Requisite Pro to do certain things. It's going to give you, you're going to have your requirements project framework there, the data dictionary there, traceability, and the impact analysis. Those kinds of basic elements are going to be in Requisite Pro. Now, one of the things that Requisite Pro has that many of the other tool sets just don't have is the data dictionary element of this. You see, if you're doing a complex project and you've got a description, you've got an object called customer, any company out there will have, 10 different definitions of a customer. And you got to be very clear. Like, is a customer somebody who's bought from you, is buying from you, has an order with you but has not bought something yet? I mean, what is a customer? And the issue that you get into with a lot of business requirements documents is that they've got very inconsistent usage of certain nomenclature. And so you want to eliminate that. So Requisite Pro also has a great data dictionary description area that you can use to actually get decent definition of what these things are all the way through. Now, finally, you're going to use Rational Software Architect for a couple of things. One is the data model. Rich data modeling, you really can't do it some of the other tool sets, so you've got to use there. And then you're going to use it for the UML diagrams specifically on the way through, because the 2.1 models, the activity diagrams, the stereotype objects, the context diagrams, these sorts of things, you really want to keep into one place that's, again, designed to do that kind of thing, and then pull it from there back into Rational Requirements Composer when you're pulling these pictures, when you're pulling a common business requirements document to and providing that to the stakeholders. So there are some issues in the implementation that, let's be candid about this. The installation of this is not trivial. You're typically doing this because you're a larger organization or, a mid-sized organization, and you've got requirements as part of a bigger concept within your organization. So you're going to put in a JAS server. There's a relational database that goes in behind that. You've got to configure the web servers associated with this, and it's complicated when you're dealing with there's a certain degree of complexity associated with this. So you're not doing this strictly for the purposes of replacing Word and Visio. You want to have downstream benefits that are important to your organization for you to be able to pick this up, to be able to go through the pain of doing the implementation. You want to plan to build capabilities. So if you're going to do especially radically compressed elicitation, you do need to build the facilitation and the elicitation skills. You do need to train people, obviously, in the tool sets that you're using, but more importantly, educating stakeholders. Because, a wonderful thing about implementing, say, agile processes is that you get far better stakeholder engagement. Like it's fundamental to agile that you've got stakeholder participation in the process and that they're there every day, or they're there through the Scrum meetings or whatever it is that you happen to be doing. But people tend not to do that when they do more plan-driven development, and so they're hamstringed. So here, what we're recommending is that you really educate people that you're doing these rapid elicitation or rapid requirements development sessions, and you need to have the right people at the table. You need to have access to the stakeholders, the decision makers, and how do you get those people to the table? The staging of the components is you are putting in multiple software products, so make sure that you have the training associated with that. Make sure that you have you are able to get to on-demand production of certain deliverables. So when you are producing something like a business requirements document, it is able to pull from the various sources that it needs to be able to produce a single requirements document that is meaningful for stakeholders. So sometimes people minimize their implementation and they end up shooting themselves in the foot because they only go with requisite Rec Pro and they don't have Composer. Therefore, the requirement spec that they're producing is just not as rich. It just doesn't have the kind of detail level modeling that they need, and therefore you get into all kinds of problems. So downstream options, and these are the critical pieces here, because downstream, many companies have problems with the requirements management, especially on very complex projects. And this is where you're bringing in the real power of what Requisite Pro is designed to do. And if you want a situation where you're doing a lot more better or much better change management, you're pulling in the traceability matrices so you know what it is that you're implementing and what's being impacted, and you can actually, when you do your testing, link it back to your traceability to make sure that you're delivering on the requirements you're supposed to be delivering. That kind of thing is nirvana for some organizations. It's critical. And you can't get there unless you're dealing with a much more automated environment like what we're talking about here. And so this may be the reason why you would go through and implement these kinds of things. Secondly, you've got requirements testing, which is a huge problem for some organizations. And so, you're going to have Rational Quality Manager built into your mix here, because that is an element that's now critical. So you're going to push from Requisite Pro and have a really high degree of integration to Rational Quality Manager. But the reason why you're doing so much upstream work in the actual tool sets themselves is because you want a much cleaner push down into the quality manager. You're not trying to test what's already been built. You're actually testing from the requirements themselves. And that means that you've got a much cleaner environment end-to-end within your organization. You're getting automated test building. You've got traceability within Rec Pro, these other kinds of things. And again, it eliminates a significant amount of cost within your organization to do this kind of thing. And then finally, model-driven development. Obviously, when you're dealing with anything that's a UML tool building with model-driven development, obviously reduces a lot of costs. The only way to get there, though, is you've got a garbage in, garbage out problem. You have to go back to how am I pulling the information into this tool set to begin with, and therefore get better, cleaner integration. So some best practices. Divide and conquer, and this means a couple of different things. First of all, use the tool that is best designed to house certain kind of information to house certain kind of information. Okay, if you're trying to bend Requisite Pro to do a bunch of things that it was never designed to do, guess what? It's not going to be good at it. But if you put the information into the different tools that are really fantastic at managing that information type, and then pull from those tools into Rec Pro to produce the common documents that you're using along the way, then now all of a sudden you're using them to your best advantage. You've divided and conquered. The same thing happens when you're talking about analysts. So you're going to use a requirements facilitator to facilitate the meeting and achieve very rapid requirements discovery. But you're going to have a person in the back there who's your requirements architect who's going to be using the Requisite Pro tool set to actually capture the information in real time and do that modeling activity, because they are now experts at using that tool set. Make sure you're adding value, so you're not going to implement something like this purely to replace Word Visio. You know, what's the point? I mean, yeah, you could, but you've got to have these downstream value adds. Whether you're sharing information out to your stakeholders much faster, or you've had problems in the past with requirements traceability or implementation, or you've had issues that you're dealing with much larger projects today, therefore you've got, you know, so whatever it is, be clear about that value add and make sure that the tool set is capable of bringing that value add to you. Listen first, model later. People invariably get hung up when they're implementing new tool sets and that they try to model in real time. And they substitute that for solid capabilities to listen and actually elicit the requirements. Don't get caught up in that. You're better off focusing on building your elicitation skills. Focus on building your ability to listen and actually ask the right questions at the right time to pull out the information from the stakeholders. Get that into a document and then begin modeling that. And you can model that, you know, in near real time, but it's, you know, in the evenings after you've pulled out the information that you need. And then you can use the tool set to push the information out to the stakeholders. It's just much more efficient use of stakeholder time. And then follow your process, because great requirements are not a document. Great requirements come from having fantastic process. So let's close on a couple of thoughts here. Very, very few tools have the ability to support rapid requirements elicitation. It's just, there are such high demands on the tool set in terms of the speed of the interface, the kinds of things that you're trying to produce, the ability to produce certain kinds of deliverables, the ability to manage certain information types, both the process and data flow and all these other kinds of things. Very few tools can do that kind of thing. So, you know, the Rational tool set can. It's one of a few. So, you know, if you are looking at or evaluating, then you might think, hey, let's look at, you know, can these tools actually do rapid requirements elicitation? And the reason being is because it forces the bar higher. It forces you to consider what happens or what's the impact of this tool on my stakeholder set. Because speed really is everything. The rate determining step now in development is less so your development team, more so your access to stakeholders. You know, how efficient is this thing going to be in front of the stakeholders? How much overhead am I adding to my business analyst team when I'm using this particular tool set? Because, you know, you're going to get into issues. If you're adding way too much overhead on your analyst teams with the adoption of a tool set, you're going to get into issues. So speed really is everything. And then be very careful in your tool set, because you want to model once, not model many times, but you also want to model consistently. And if you're not achieving that goal, then you remove many of the downstream benefits that you would normally be attacking or achieving once you've implemented this kind of technology setup. So let's go back to the learning objectives, and I'm going to finish up very fast here because I've got like 2 minutes to go. We want to make sure that we're identifying the benefits of using a rapid requirements elicitation approach, and I hope I hit that in the first 3 or 4 slides along the discussion. Particularly the major issue, which is, you know, are you radically compressing total time required of the stakeholders, and are you radically compressing or reducing the number of changes to requirements? Those are the 2 biggies for doing this kind of thing. You want to make sure you understand the way in which the products are being set up and the process that's sitting in behind it. And then the artifacts and deliverables is the last part of the presentation. What are all of the artifacts and deliverables that are being produced and why? And then a reminder quickly about IAG. We are an organization that focuses on requirements discovery management, and we use these tools on a regular basis out on engagements. when we're doing requirements discovery management. In fact, training people or training analysts and doing best practices and implementing these kinds of tools into turnkey centers of excellence is the kind of thing that we do. Certainly the core of our capability comes from that whole ability to ask the right questions at the right time, be able to elicit information from the stakeholder group, and then produce clear, accurate, complete deliverables. So with that, thank you very much for your time and attention today. I wish you all great success. And I'm going to try to answer some of the questions that are coming in here from the different participants. So Chad, you're asking how rational tools compare to something from iRise. There's a very significant differences between the rational tools. First of all, rational is a much bigger suite. The iRise tools, hey look, by the way, iRise, wonderful technology, okay? Like they've got some very specific things, but it's really for visualization. It's not really designed for anything beyond that. It's for very rapid mock-up of screen and flow that you can kind of do a mock-up where you can do a walkthrough with your clients or with your stakeholders of how that's going to visually flow from screen to screen to screen. That's what iRise is designed to do. It's a great technology for that kind of thing. You can do that kind of thing within the IBM toolset as well. The visualization is quite capable within the IBM toolset as well. But IBM's toolset does far more than that because it's actually a requirements management tool, it's actually a modeling tool, it's actually a process modeling tool, a data modeling tool, all these other kinds of things, which the iRise toolset physically doesn't do. I had another question here with respect to getting the IAG templates. Yeah, you can. Just if you go to www.iag.biz and you want to just sign up and then go to the templates area, pull the template from there, and it's a Word plugin that you get, and then you can just interact with that in through the IBM toolset. Jeff, isn't it a common experience that stakeholders will want to leave the room to do before they finalize the requirement? You know, it depends on how fast you are, really. It's a common experience that the customers don't want to be there, or the stakeholders don't want to be there when you're doing more detailed modeling activities. That's true. But the stakeholders absolutely want to be there as you are extracting from them and they're coming to terms on what the business wants to do. In other words, they need to be there as you're uncovering the business process flow, data flow, business rule set that's really driving behind the application. That's why we say capture in real time. We've got a template plugin that we use that's really hyper efficient. It's very fast. It can capture in real time extremely quickly. And we plug that into Requisite Pro. But they tend not to want to be there when you're doing deep analysis and the modeling activities that are happening. Now, the issue for us that may be different in our environment versus yours is our environment has a lag time on documentation production of about an hour or two. In other words, on a smaller engagement, if we're working Monday to Friday on the engagement, Thursday night we produce the documentation. Friday night we're walking through it with people. So there's no lag time in terms of documentation production and actually physically sitting down with clients. And so as a result of that, you're getting a lot less of this kind of issue that you're dealing with here. Yes, you can. If you want my presentation, just send me an email to kls@iag.biz, and it's on the screen in front of you. So, Randy, hopefully that helps you with that one. And there's a number of other questions that are coming in that I'm going to try to get back and answer offline rather than run overtime here as well today. So, thank you very much for your time, attention, and participation. In fact, I may stick around and try to answer a few more of these questions. But certainly, for those of you that do have to go, I appreciate your time today and thank you very much. How involved is IAG in the overhead of production implementation? Okay, so Zechariah, you've got a question about how much time or extra time is actually involved in doing this kind of thing. If you take your normal cycle for doing requirements and you add maybe about 10% or something like that, that's about the extra that you're going to add if you're using a tool set like this. You're not really adding a huge amount of overhead associated with a tool set like this. Jeff, you're asking about Rational versus Blueprint. Again, Blueprint is very much a visualization tool. It's not the same kind of thing as what we're talking about here. Blueprint, for example, is that you don't have the ability to capture information flow in the same way. as you would with a rational tool set. You certainly can't model processes in the same way. It's designed really to capture an upfront visualization of the process, attach visualizations in behind associated with that, and then allow what I'll call animation of the tool, or allow animation of the requirements. So you basically allow the stakeholder to interact with a visual mock-up of the technology. And what's cool in Blueprint is that you actually have more detail in there. You actually have more detail in there that you can put in business rules and things like that, and it will auto-generate test cases and things like that. But it doesn't have the same breadth. You can get a lot of that capability in the IBM toolset, but it doesn't have the same breadth, say, at the IBM toolset. Axie, yes, you can absolutely get my my slides if you ask for them. Okay, so with that, thank you all very much for your time and attention today, and I wish you all great success. Cheers.
Thank you, Keith, for a very informative presentation, and thank you everyone for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar. I wanted to point out that the webinar, along with the slides, will be archived at ModernAnalyst.com within a few days. This concludes today's event, and we hope you have a great day. I also would like to apologize for the delay on the presentation, but, well, technology gets in the way sometimes. So